Are you the fanatic we're looking for? Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast, brought to you by the Draft Professor. The Draft Professor is the only interactive and dynamic mock draft simulator. Dynamic means that the picks from one mock draft will influence the players that team selects in the next mock draft. This can be done with a first-round challenge. This can be done with a second-round challenge. This will be done with any mock draft from the Draft Professor. In addition, the Draft Professor has rank players functionality, allowing you to rank players and build your own big board and then compare your board to that of other users at the Draft Professor. In addition, the Draft Professor has draft a team functionality. This allows 2 or more users to snake draft a team of 22 players from the rookie pool, and then you can debate which players you like at which position and why. Thank you for tuning in to this podcast. This episode will begin shortly. Well, welcome to our first draft roundtable. This was an idea that Bill and I kind of cooked up and said, well, if we put enough of us in a room, the conversation should be pretty good. So today we're going to talk about the Cincinnati Bengals and the LA Rams. I had to make sure I got that one right. And they were Super Bowl teams in 2021. Their teams took different paths to get to 2024. So we're going to kind of talk about that. But before we do that, we have some new guests and some familiar faces. So Sam, welcome to the channel. Do you want to kind of introduce yourself a little bit?
Hey everyone, my name is Sam Teets. I've been doing some in-depth content on the NFL draft for probably the past 3 years or so now. I run a Substack account called Sports Talk with Sam Teets, where you can find all my draft content for free. I try to get stuff out there about 5 or 6 times a week. So I love doing this, and I'm grateful for the chance to connect with all of you and have a show together and have some great conversations.
Cool. Ryan.
Yeah, hey, I'm Ryan Sparks. I do not create content currently. I just do this on my own for fun. I teach mass communications for the military right now, but I'm a big analytics and stats nerd and just love my Bengals. Whether that's a good thing or not is up to you. But yeah, excited to be here. Love talking football.
Fantastic. And Brock, welcome back.
Thank you, sir. Yes, my name is Brock. Jim reached out. We started speaking about the draft a couple years ago. Since then, we've both grown to do separate things within the football community. I am now the beat writer for the Roundtable Sports Illustrated, and I can't wait to talk about the team and just can't wait to break down the draft with all you great guys.
Cool. Bill, welcome back. It's like I just saw you an hour ago.
I know. We were just talking Senior Bowl coverage on the Draft Professor YouTube channel. So after this episode's over, go back and check that out. But you can find a lot of my content on X at Spark Scouting. I'm also a writer and analyst for CadesDraftRoom.com as well. So very happy to be here and kind of join the round table and see what comes out of it, cover all things NFL draft content.
Cool. So I'm going to kick off the conversation. So this is research that I do a lot, and this is just what I would say basic team building. So I went through every NFL roster and I counted the number of players that the team had on its roster that year that it drafted. So for example, in 2021, the Bengals had 31 players they drafted on their roster, and the Rams had 32. Okay. And then in 2024, the Bengals had 35 people on their roster they drafted. And the Rams had 31 this year, right? Now, what's different is that the Bengals had 13 players in common between 2021 and 2024. So basically, they're trying to keep, the Jamar Chases and the T. Higgins of the world, right? So they're manipulating their cap, whereas the Rams, if you could believe this, they have the lowest number of players in the league from 2021 to 2024. They pretty much gutted their entire roster. There's only 3 players left from 2021 on the current Rams roster. So the question that I would just kind of put out there is, from a team building approach, that's very different, right? The Rams gutted the roster and they're a playoff team back-to-back years. And how many times have the Bengals made the playoffs since they went to the Super Bowl? Is it just once?
Yeah, they made once, and then they had the Burrow injury, and then now this year. So
yeah, so very different paths. And I guess the question would be, if you look at team building, Brock, and you look at like how the Rams did it or how the Bengals did it, do you have an opinion on that, Brock?
I do. Unlike a lot of the other situations around the NFL, the reason why the Rams have such a low amount of players from the 2021 roster still on the team is because simply the cap space and the way they went about winning their Super Bowl. If we remember correctly, they made a multitude of trades using high level first round or high value picks in order to build their roster, sending multiple picks away for players like Jalen Ramsey and Matthew Stafford and such. They also traded up for the number 1 pick for Jared Goff in 2016, which kind of affected their ability to build out from that point forward. Alongside the fact they spent a fair amount of money to maintain a bunch of the superstars outside of just Matthew Stafford and Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey, the big names. They also gave massive extensions to Cooper Kupp, rightfully deserved, Robert Woods, Leonard Floyd, amongst others. So all of their players that were on rookie deals, they simply could not afford to give a second contract to, thus leading to them having to replace them in the draft. One thing that has worked out for them is that they've been really good in the later rounds of the draft. So it's a process that has been able to work. And about last year is when we finally saw the F them picks era, and I think so-called titled themselves for winning the Super Bowl LVI. I forget what number that is. Kind of finally start the bill was finally paid off at that point, and now you're going to see a Rams team that's going to have a tremendous amount of cap space entering this offseason. So you're going to see that number start to rise. But the reason is because they spent so much that they couldn't afford to really keep anybody outside of the major stars.
Yeah. So does anybody here think that the Rams, like, going all in to win the Super Bowl was like a bad move? Like, when they made it, did anybody
They got
here
a Super
think,
Bowl.
like,
Yeah.
what was
They
that,
got
Ryan?
a Super Bowl. They got a Super Bowl, so you can't call it a bad move.
But
Like that's
at the
my
time
view
they
on it.
made the moves,
Yeah.
did you question whether they were good? Obviously, hindsight shows that they were good moves, but did anybody here think that the Rams were like, that's not the way to do it?
I mean,
It's very risky, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you get it wrong, you're fired. You're gone in a couple of years. Like, you don't have that job long term. You don't get a second chance at that if you go in and you add all these players who have now either moved on or retired. That includes Odell Beckham, Von Miller, and Aaron Donald was drafted there, but like guys like Andrew Whitworth is there. Eric Weddle was a signing at some point in time. Odell Beckham Jr., Jalen Ramsey, all these big names. You had a roster built around these core pillars, and then you had kind of filled in around the edges with more cheaper players that you could. Those players are all now gone, and you did a really good job turning the roster over. But again, like, it was a very risky move. It worked out for them. We've seen a number of other teams try to do this and have it not work out. Like, they try to build these super teams, they blow up in their faces, and they kind of, everyone ends up out of a job eventually, and you have to turn it all over again. But for the Rams, because it was successful, it goes down as a historic, feather in the cap for that front office, for that coaching staff. But there's definitely a way this could have ended poorly for them. Had they even lost the Super Bowl, look what's going on with the 49ers right now. You had that Super Bowl loss hangover sometimes when you had these star players. It could have ended very differently had they not won the Super Bowl, but they did. And so now we look back on that with it being a great roster building example, but that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
So, Sam, what other teams do you think tried it and it blew up in their face? I think those were your words, right? You said some teams tried it and it blew up in their face. Who do you think those teams are?
Yeah, I think we've seen a little bit with the 49ers to some extent. Now, the 49ers have drafted quite a few people to the roster. It's not like they haven't done strictly just free agency. They've done a lot of drafting that's worked out very effectively for them. But they have added guys like Javarius Ward, Trent Williams as well. And those pieces have certainly started to age out here late in the process. Trent's been missing games the past couple of years. Him and Ward have had some unfortunate off the field tragedies that have kept them away from the game this year. I think the Eagles tried doing it a bit with the Chip Kelly era when they brought in Nnamdi Asomugha coming off multiple All-Pro seasons with the Raiders. That certainly didn't work out from a chemistry perspective. So those are the two teams that really stand out to me immediately. I don't have another teams off the top of my head, but I'm sure we could probably scrounge up another 3 to 5 if we really thought about it.
Yeah. I mean, another one you could throw in there is the New Orleans Saints that were still trying to deal with the post-Drew Brees era and just kept throwing cap and throwing cap and throwing cap and kicking the can down the road. Hopefully it would catch on, and it still hasn't. So that would be one I would say. The Rams aren't necessarily lucky. They drafted well, but the Saints is kind of that inverse in that, yes, you can pump all of this money into a team, but you have to support it with lower end, cheaper end talent. And the Saints just haven't been able to necessarily do that.
Yeah. So I want to piggyback on that, but before I do that, Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is the Rams right now, they just look like geniuses because not only did it work out, they got the Super Bowl, but recently they've drafted so well. Some of those young stars are turning out to be such great picks. So now they're back, in contention again. So that is such a rare case that doesn't normally happen. So yeah, I think they look like geniuses because of it, and you got to applaud that front office.
Yes.
I was going to add, I know this is probably not supposed to come out of my mouth considering my affiliations. I'm in the complete opposite of the opinion. I think this is an awful way to build a franchise. And I think that we don't recognize the incredible amount of luck that had to go the way of the Rams the entire postseason for that move to actually pay off for them. Antoine Winfield being beat by Cooper Kupp deep to lose to Tampa Bay played a massive factor into that. Gibson dropping the game-sealing interception in the NFC Championship game played a massive role into that. Logan Wilson getting called for was it Logan Wilson? I'm not even saying the linebacker.
It was.
Getting called for a defensive pass interference on a very ticky-tacky call in the Super Bowl went their way for the Rams as well. But the biggest piece of luck that they had is that Puka Nacua turned out to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. There's an example of that process that the Rams did happening right across the street from them in the Chargers. The Chargers went all in at the end of the Tom Telesco, Brandon Staley era, and we kind of saw how that worked out for them. I mean, fortunately for them this year, they brought in a general manager and a head coach that could work with the situation they had, but they had 4 players taking up a massive majority of the cap, and none of them played the quarterback position. So I think looking forward, teams that try to emulate the Rams, unfortunately, are thinking about the ends instead of realizing the path that it took to get there. And even the Rams now will never do anything like that again unless a new GM comes in. I don't think Les Snead will ever trade the house for anything of that sort of situation because they recognize, one, how lucky they got, and they were all witnesses to the aftermath the season after when they were absolutely getting destroyed by every other team in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think the Rams sit there and they regret that they got their butt handed to them the year after?
Oh, I think they regret it because they were able to achieve the Super Bowl. But yeah. I think that's like winning the lottery. Like, it only happens 1 in a trillion times. Because, again, like we've talked about, so many other teams have done it, and those teams haven't even made the playoffs, let alone made it to the Super Bowl or won it. Again, when you look at the way football is played and how things can change so rapidly on you, the fact that they had 4 major moments line up for them in the way that they did, or even 3 in back-to-back weeks, I think plays a massive factor in their evaluations about how they'll go about building a Super Bowl contender going forward. It is my opinion that the first Super Bowl they went to, when they lost to the Patriots, that is how you build a team. I think they were just so desperate to kind of get that feeling back that they went all in without truly thinking, and that led to, 1, a great amount of success for them, but then to the rest of the league, a fair amount of detrimental moves made by them for their organizations.
So I'm going to sell a little bit, Brock. So here would be my take on that. So the Rams drafted relatively well. So that Super Bowl team, they had 31 players on that team that they drafted. So they built through the draft, and then they added about 5 key starters named Von Miller, Leonard Floyd, Jalen Ramsey. Those are the immediate 3. And then I think they brought a safety in off of retirement for that playoff run.
Eric Weddle.
Yep.
Right. So they brought in a couple of key pieces, right? And I do think from a Super Bowl competition standpoint, I think teams are definitely doing that. If they see that they're missing 1 or 2 starters, they're making the trades at the deadline. Chiefs did, the Bills did this year, right? And they weren't the only teams making moves like that. So I think teams do that. They just don't necessarily sell out to do it.
I think it also goes back a little bit when you, me, and Newt talked about the DNA of a rebuild aspect and having that organizational vision from the top down. If you're a GM, say Snead or McVay were on the hot seat before they made all those trades, they're not going to be nearly as they're going to be risk averse to make those trades. Whereas if you're a GM who's confident the owner's not going to let you go at the end of the season, you can get riskier with some of the trades. You can throw additional draft capital and trades to get the guys you want. But that's another thing. And your owner has to be, I won't say quick triggered, but he's got to understand the vision of where you're trying to go 3, 4, 5 years down the line, especially in a league where it's all about an immediate satisfaction, immediate turnaround.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about the Bengals situation, because you couldn't have better job security than Duke Tobin of the Bengals. That I don't know what he would have to do to lose his job, but the Bengals are wildly still risk averse, and that's probably because they're one of the only owners that their money is just the team. That's it. So it's definitely interesting seeing the difference, because like with the Bengals, the issues for us is 2021. Everybody talks about we drafted Jamar Chase and that got us to the Super Bowl. Had very little to do with us getting to the Super Bowl. Like, yes, it was a great draft pick, but our budget free agents that all ended up being home runs that year is what really got us to the Super Bowl. And then the rest of that 2021 draft was so abysmal, and then the 2022 draft abysmal, that's why we're in the situation that we're in now. So
Yeah,
and Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the front office for Cincinnati has like fewer people in the scouting department, I think, than generally. They have less people in like personnel in general than some of the bigger teams and bigger organizations.
This round table is about the size of the Bengals scouting department. Yeah.
And we might say that this roundtable might be more qualified than the Bengals scouting department too.
Could be. I'm not kidding though. I'm pretty sure it's 5. So.
Yep.
Yeah, and just to kind of jump off of Ryan's point of why things went so different for the Rams and the Bengals, Stan Kroenke has never been afraid to give players large sign bonuses, which when it comes to the salary cap, I'm still trying to understand it. But from what I do understand so far, 1, it's accounting, not actual cash, and 2, if you can give a larger portion up front or put more money in escrow, that is less that goes on your cap. And Mike Brown actually has to pull out loans if he wants to do that. That's why the Rams situation was easier to kind of work with, because were backed by a rich owner. It also helps the fact that a lot of their big time contracts that they spent were not made that offseason prior. So they had more flexibility to do these things. When you look at the Bengals, I think that 1, they're going to lose a superstar every year. They've done it. Tyler Boyd, Joe Mixon, Jesse Bates, so on and so forth. And then they keep on trying to replace them with players that may not be at, to Ryan's point, where the Rams kind of have like this different kind of mindset going about it, just straight up getting players that will rise up together instead of replacing a single position. I think that's why they've been much successful in the past 2 years getting back to the playoffs, because they go through that struggle together instead of automatically having a first-year guy trying to replace a guy that had 5 years of NFL experience.
So does anybody here think Cincinnati's on the same path as Dallas? They're just like a year or 2 behind with how they're building their roster. Like, Ryan, does that resonate with you, or you don't want me to compare the Bengals to the Cowboys?
I mean, it's so hard because they have the ability, like they're gonna spend a lot more Like the Bengals are so conservative, like they don't guarantee money past the first year of contracts pretty much, which is what makes things very, very challenging a lot of times because most of those stars want, longer guaranteed money. So, I mean, the number wasn't the issue for like not getting Jamar Chase done. It was the guarantees. It was the little things, right? It's hard to tell. Honestly, the Bengals situation is always just so different than most other teams. I think they're more similar to the Steelers, the way that they run things, honestly, more than just about any other team.
Okay.
Still some old fashioned contract styles. They don't do the newer, more creative, flexible contracts. Joe Burrow's contract is probably the most flexible one they've ever done. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, and just kind of want to add, you say the Steelers, but I also think you guys are very similar to the Raiders as well in terms of just finances in general and how they go about things. I mean, the reason why Khalil Mack became a Bear was because they were moving to Las Vegas, and Mark Davis couldn't afford to put the $40 million or so needed for a signing bonus in escrow. And the unfortunate part is when you look at those two organizations, when they were coming up and when they were great back in the 20th century, they were drafting extremely well. And of course, there was a lot of different rules when it came to money back then. You look at them in the modern era, and I still feel like, please correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan. But to your point, as you're saying with Pittsburgh, they still kind of share in those same mentalities with players that have modern ideas of how their contracts should run and how much they should be paid and things like that. And I just feel that kind of with the Rams situation, I feel like they have such a strong culture that they're able to kind of move on from those kind of touchy subjects a bit quicker once the ink is signed. When it comes to Cincinnati, I feel like especially with their wide receiver positions, though T. Higgins has expressed that he wants to return to be a Bengal, if they don't put up the money that he thinks that he wants, he's more than willing to walk away, unlike a situation where LA will do the opposite, say, hey, you think you want that much money? All right, we'll just give it to you anyway. How that is going to impact the rest of the league, that's kind of like that in-between kind of thing, I'm kind of interested to see. I want to get you guys' opinions about as we move forward with this draft process.
Yeah, this honestly, this offseason is going to be probably the most interesting for me as a Bengal fan because we haven't had a quarterback that's been as vocal about Joe Burrow is very calculated with what he's been saying lately. T. Higgins is calculated with what he's saying. T. Higgins switching agents, the same agent as Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase is being very calculated about what he's saying. They're putting pressure on the front office. So we're either going to have a situation like Carson Palmer put pressure on the front office, but he didn't do it as publicly and then eventually just asked for the trade. But Joe Burrow knows what he's doing. He knows what he means to this city. So it's definitely going to be an interesting offseason. But yeah, I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, but you mentioned the fact that the Bengals are always trying to replace the guy, replace the star instead of sign the star, right? That's literally what happened in 2021. Like we let Carl Lawson walk because he wanted more money, and we're like, we're gonna go get this budget guy and pay Trey Hendrickson. Worked out, but then we're like, we're gonna go let Jesse Bates walk and draft Dax Hill, who's not really a safety. Didn't work. So those are the type of things that happen.
That was why I compared the Bengals to the Cowboys. Because, Ryan, as you just described to me, that is the Dallas Cowboys team building, right? They're trying to take a defensive tackle they let walk and they replace him with a Mozzie Smith that doesn't work. And you could rinse, repeat on the offensive line or even running back, right? How many of us were surprised when Dallas didn't draft a running back last year? Right? That kind of thing. Like they're not even – in some cases, they're not even trying to replace, right? Because that's almost foul team building when you don't have a starting running back and then you also choose not to draft one. Kind of thing.
Right. It would also make sense too, like if you're Dallas in that case, we'll just spin it to the Cowboys. If there's some sort of, hey, this is what we want to do as a franchise, this is what we want to do as a front office. But the front office is Jerry's world. What Jerry wants to do, Jerry is. Cincinnati's the same way. The front office is 5 people. I mean, we have more people at the draft professor than Cincinnati has in their front office. So it's very hard to say, what they want to do, because there's only 5 people, and it's very, that's why you see teams that have, player personnel departments, scouting departments, analytics departments, the accounting departments. There's teams with full robust departments that are having more success than your Cincinnati's or your Dallas's in some aspects, because there's more chefs in the kitchen, but there's also a head chef that everything rolls up to. So the head chef in Los Angeles is Les Snead. In Philly, it's Howie Roseman. Everything rolls up to him, but he also knows how to lead down and say, okay, I'm not the best salary cap guy, but let me call Brock, who's my salary cap guy. I'm not the best contract guy. Let me call Sam. Sam's my contract guy. So then they have that ability and they have that foundation that they can then say, okay, well, I have a guy in my front office room that says this is the right move, or no, this is the wrong move. I'm going to trust that. Whereas teams like Cincinnati, Dallas, the Raiders, even New Orleans as well, may not necessarily have that. They're still kind of the old way of, we've got one head guy that can do it all, and then we, sprinkle in some interns here and there, but it's the one guy that runs the show.
So, Sam, if you had to kind of look at the Rams and the Bengals, who do you think makes it to a conference championship game first out of those two teams?
Well, the Bengals have the quarterback long term. I think the Rams are operating on a much shorter term situation here with Stafford and some lingering injuries he has built up over the years. But I do feel more comfortable saying the Rams right now, simply because the way that they've gone about their process. You look at losing all those star players they had from a couple of years ago helps you out with the comp pick formula. They have a large number of picks. They've made, in the past 3 years, they've made 32 overall picks compared to 24 for the Bengals. And with the draft, there's some science to it. There's certainly a lot of talent that goes into evaluation, a lot of time, a lot of effort, staffing as well. There's also a lot of luck. So the more bites of the apple you get, the more likely you are to find some guys in these later round situations. And the Rams have done a great job of that from a talent ID perspective, but also because they have simply just had more picks to do that with. And that ability to have those number of selections turn over that back end of the roster and find these guys makes you feel very comfortable that they know how to identify players, and they know the process about how to make sure they get the most out of these players. And they just don't resign some of these guys. They get in a Jacoby Durant who comes in. They get a Kyron Williams, Quentin Lake. They get Darren Kendrick, can get you a year or two in here. You get some of these guys who are not necessarily long-term starters, but players who can work for you for 3 to 4 years on cheap contracts, and then you turn them over again. And that's kind of a way to make sure you have some financial flexibility going forward. So I like the Rams, what they've done so far, and just have more faith in the brain trust they have that they're going to be able to continue to build this roster, even if you might run into a situation with Cooper Kupp or Matthew Stafford where aged injuries or issues.
Yeah. It also goes back to your coaching staff too, because, when you talk about it, you have guys like Les Snead and, Duke Tobin that can get those players for you. But once you get them there, you've got to get them on the field and put them in the right situations to succeed. So if I'm a GM and I'm drafting and I draft a player and I give him to a Sean McVay, is he going to develop in the way that he should? Is Sean McVay going to go out there and put him in the best position to succeed, and vice versa for Zach Taylor? If I draft him and Zach Taylor, say I draft a wide receiver who's best in the slot, but then Zach Taylor's putting him on the boundary 40, 50 snaps a game, is that the best position for him? So it also goes down to your coaching staff, which again rolls down from your ownership hiring your GM hiring the head coach hiring his assistants to help develop the players that you then select, because anybody can go in and select players. They can draft players, but the ultimate test of how good your reload or your rebuild is going to be is, do you have the coaching staff in place to get them on the field? And once they're on the field, the best situation for them to succeed.
Yeah, I don't think Les Snead or Sean McVay get enough credit for how good they are as a GM, a scout, and a coach. Mm-hmm. Because I think, to Brock's point that he made many minutes earlier in the podcast, when the Rams gutted the roster after the Super Bowl win, they didn't have high draft capital, and they were able to actually field a team that had UDFA, right? Like the roster coming out of the Super Bowl, they had UDFA making the team, and I didn't do a count to find out how many of those guys were UDFAs, but I thought at one point I counted upwards of 20 on the roster and practice squad. but I don't have the exact number. But in order to have that many UDFA contributing, you have to give credit to a scout.
In 2023, the Rams had 18.5% of their roster was UDFAs.
Do you have a ranking as to where that was in the league?
It actually looks pretty low, which is surprising. But this is 2023. You have the Broncos with 33.9%. So it's all over the place. But that you got to remember too that a lot of that's back end guys. The Rams were getting like big contributions from some of those UDFAs.
Yeah, and even in this past season, I believe 5 UDFAs made the roster, and majority of their defensive roster has come into the league within the past 4 years. A bunch of guys Sam has already touched on. When you look at their defensive line, their starting four up front are either rookies or in their second year. Byron Young, Colby Turner, Britton Fisk, and Jared Verse. So something that is my own philosophy, I kind of want to get your thoughts on because the Bengals did it way differently than I would have, is to me, when you build the offensive defensive lines are the top priority outside of quarterback. And sometimes I even think you should build up your own defensive lines before you go and try and get a quarterback. But that's also an NFL where patience is a thing that's accepted. And obviously that's not the modern environment we live in. But I feel like you have to draft your offensive linemen. You have to have them come together. And then you go out in free agency, you add 1 or 2 guys to that to kind of round it off. I feel like the Bengals did the complete opposite, where they went out and just kept signing guys, and that really didn't help mold a strong pass blocking unit for Burrow. But Ryan, I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's they had to go sign guys because they did draft guys. They just weren't very good. I mean, they in 2021 they drafted 3 offensive linemen that year. Jackson Carman, Deontay Smith, Trey Hill. Don't know. Well, Jackson Carman might be starting for Miami this week, unfortunately for Miami. But then they drafted Cordell Volson the following year. So it's not like they haven't drafted O-line. The issue is that teams have
draft the right ones.
Yeah. The teams have different players that they just don't like positions they don't seem to draft well. Like the Bengals can find wide receivers. They're going to draft wide receivers pretty well most of the time. And they seem to do well at drafting linebackers as well. But they cannot draft offensive linemen at all. And I don't know what it is. It's got to be somebody in the front office that has their own thing. But that's where it is. Like, they did try. It's just they failed miserably. Nobody had Jackson Carman in the 46th pick. And they traded up to get him when they could have just taken Creed Humphrey.
Yeah. And that's the thing too. We don't talk about with team building, and Brock hit the nail on the head. For me, when I'm looking to build a team, it's you get your quarterback, you protect your quarterback, and then you get after the opposing team's quarterback. Those are your top 3. Is it necessarily in that order? Does it have to be? No. If you're a team like the New England Patriots, for example, and you're sitting there and a Drake May is 3 overall, would you pass him up and come into this class to get your guy, or do you just take your guy and sit him on the bench? But it also goes back to what we've talked about, the impatience. GMs and head coaches are given a 3-year window at best to figure it out and turn it around. And if they don't turn it around, they'll just get someone in there who can. So, you have to kind of play that tightrope balancing act, which is where good teams will rely on multiple people to help you balance it out. For every bad offensive line pick that you make, you can have a good defensive line pick to help kind of balance you out, because then you can also turn that defensive line into either future draft capital, or maybe you swing a trade with another player for player team to get you that offensive line. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to draft the guy, but you also have to kind of play that balancing act when you know where your weakness is. And you also have to be cognizant that you had the weakness. Maybe Cincinnati's front office thinks that they're all-stars when drafting offensive line, all 6 of them.
Yeah. So Sam, you were listening to the podcast last night, and I know you and Ryan were both in the chat. So Sam, if you had to pick which positions you would build a team around, how would you do it? I guess it's just the open question.
Yeah. So the 5 positions I generally see as being these premier ones are obviously quarterback, receiver, offensive tackle, cornerback, and edge rusher. Those are the 5 for me. You can tier them however you will prefer, but obviously quarterback starts off, and you work from there, and you kind of go with the next 4 based on what's available, in my opinion. Like, you want to make sure you get elite players if you can. If you have, say, there's usually 12 to 17 first-round grades for teams in a given draft class. So you have maybe like just 12 this year. You want to make sure you get one of those guys for yourself. So it depends on basically who's available on the board in a given context. Offensive tackles right now that are premier players tend to be more rare than receivers. So you have blue chip receiver, blue chip offensive tackle available. That tackle is going to be worth a lot more to your franchise long-term probably than the receiver, because you can get a quality wide receiver 2 in the second round. I mean, we've seen how these drafts have turned out. You can get wide receivers who are good players late first, mid-second round, and it works out. I would really try to start with the offensive line in that situation, and that's very difficult. Cornerback is a position I would probably leave last among the premier positions because coverage ability and cornerback play is so... it varies so much year to year. You can have a guy who's an all-pro one year and then is not top 5 to 6 corner in the year the next year. And he might be a really talented player, but it's just hard. You don't find guys anymore who are these 10-year players but are consistently top 5 players at the position and corners. It just doesn't happen. The guys tend to fall off very quickly. They have up and down years. It's just very hard to find consistent cornerback play, even among the great corners in the NFL. Versus edge rushers, play is usually translatable pretty much year to year. Same with tackles. So I'd say like you start with the quarterback, and then depending on what you need, I think that offensive tackle, edge rusher, wide receiver is next up, and then corner is that final one of the 5 premier positions, in my opinion.
Ryan, any thoughts on that? Because actually, I thought the way that Sam articulated it was actually better than we did in the podcast last night.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Like, to me, I don't care as much about the quarterback until, I've got that trench play down. I'm getting much higher on a D tackle lately, but with how much that seems to be like, because to me, you have to balance the price of people too. And D tackle price and interior lines going up so much. But that's why, like, this year for me, Bengals, like, I want them to sign an interior offensive lineman and draft a couple, because we've seen what Joe Burrow can do with a horrendous offensive line. So, like, I can't even imagine like what we would be doing if we actually had protection. But yeah, the trenches is key. Like, Bill, you were saying, you gotta protect your quarterback, get after the opposing quarterback. The Bengals don't do either of those things, and it's a miracle that we actually somehow have a shot this weekend. Go Chiefs! But
how many times have you said "Go Chiefs" in your life?
I just threw up a little, actually. So
I don't think anybody outside of Kansas City would say that without throwing up right now.
Yeah, and I'm just like, so with the Bills game, I'm just like, I don't want anybody to get hurt. Truth be told, I do not want to face Joe Burrow in the playoffs, right? But I would rather be rested and healthy facing Joe Burrow than any alternative. But I don't Buffalo winning or losing isn't going to have any influence in Cincinnati. But I know that the Kansas City game does. But yeah, watching Joe Burrow play, he is definitely on fire right now.
if something were to happen that we actually like, the path that we would have to play if we did get in would be Bills, Kansas City, most likely Ravens, just to get to the Super Bowl. So like, I'm not getting my hopes up. I'm just enjoying watching Joe Burrow until the season's over. So
I actually had the opposite take. I said, something, if Buffalo has to beat Burrow, then Jackson, then Mahomes to go to the Super Bowl, nobody's going to be able to take anything away from Josh. He beat the 3 other best quarterbacks in the league. Yep. Right. And I mean, that's what the media would say.
And things could always be worse for you guys, because you could be starting your 40th quarterback since 1999. So you got to look at the bright side that you have your guys, because here in Cleveland, we have struggled to get a guy. The closest that we had was probably Baker, but even then, by his own admission, Baker said that it was never going to work out. He had growing up to do, and then we swung the trade for redacted. So we're going to leave it at that. But it could always be worse. So you gotta enjoy good quarterback play when you see it.
Bill, honest question: do you think that is Cleveland in the quarterback market this draft, or do you think they're just going to try to roll it back with some vets on the team next year? Like, do you think there's a legit chance they draft a guy if they're in position to do so?
So there's two schools of thought. I would say that the quarterback market that they're in is a cheap veteran. The Kirk Cousins smoke, there's fire there. I can tell you that from some of my contacts that I've talked about. I think in a perfect world, what they're going to do is they're going to roll with Cousins, redacted, and then a late day 3 selection in this quarterback class that you can take a guy on a developmental flyer. You know, if you're going to look at guys, a Jackson Dart, a Curtis Rourke, those types of guys that, you know, like a lottery ticket. But by all accounts, they're going to build around the team and get a good infrastructure, because his deal is going to roll off in 26 or 27, depending on how they cut it, as far as a post June 1 cut or a pre June 1 cut. But I don't see any world where they go with one of the top 2 guys in Ward or Sanders, unless this team just absolutely falls in love with them during the process.
So different. It's the same question, but I'm going to ask it a different way. Are the Browns a quarterback away from being a playoff team?
Depending on who you
go ahead.
Depending on who you ask, some people will say yes. I say no. There are some glaring holes that the Watson trade didn't hurt as much from a salary cap standpoint, because you can roll it over using restructures and you can roll it over using extensions. What hurt the most from the Watson trade was the amount of capital that this team gave up in leveraging their future, just like, you know, Les Snead in his F them picks era. We did it all in one shot. So now you're seeing an offensive line that's getting significantly older, a wide receiver core that outside of Jerry Jeudy is mostly young guys who've yet to emerge. Nick Chubb is not going to be the same Chubb as he has been in years past with his injuries, and the only running back behind him in Jerome Ford is a better Robin than he is a Batman. And that's just offensively. Defensively, there's still some injuries. I don't think that they're a quarterback away. Now, saying that, can a good quarterback mask some of these issues like Joe Burrow does in Cincinnati for them? Absolutely. But to get that level of a guy, you either have to get extremely lucky and hit at the top of the draft, or you have to pay for that guy. And with the amount of effort that you've rolled over Watson's contract with, I don't know if it'd be responsible to go and pay a Sam Darnold, a 3-year, $100 million deal. It just wouldn't be responsible for team building purposes.
Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of where I was going, is that what is responsible team building if you know that you're more than a quarterback away? Like, to Brock's point, build your offensive line before you draft the quarterback. I think I heard Brock say that a few minutes ago, right? Yeah. And like a lot of times, like as I look around, like especially for the playoff teams and then the first few teams that were out of the playoffs. So the Bengals would fall into that category, whether they make the playoffs or not. The Bengals at any given season, they could literally go right to the top. They have the top end talent, possible Hall of Fame players on the roster. I might even argue the Bengals have more Hall of Fame players on their roster than Buffalo does. Kind of thing, right? Between Chase and Burrow, 2 is greater than 1.
Yep.
Kind of thing, right? And we have Von Miller, but he's not a Hall of Fame player at his current level, right? He's going to make the Hall of Fame, but that's not the level of play that he is on the field, no. Right? So if you were to look around the league, how many teams that aren't making the playoffs do you think are a draft away? They get, they nail 3 to 4 draft picks, and we're talking about them the same way we're pretty much, let's say, gushing about the Rams or the Bengals, right? Because the Rams and the Bengals are both close.
I would say if you're looking at teams that are going to miss the playoffs this year, I'll give you one that's kind of on the fringe, and it's the Atlanta Falcons. And part of it is because they found their guy at quarterback in Penix, which right now he looks to be the guy. Will he be that way in 2-3 years down the line? It remains to be seen. But hitting on a young quarterback is so important nowadays in team building because, you look at like what San Francisco did initially with Brock Purdy. They got him as a very late round guy and didn't have to pay him 35, 40, 50 million dollars. Paying a guy that much money is going to put a hamper on what you can put around him. So when you look at that, I think Atlanta just needs to get some pieces, especially along the defensive line, defensive interior, get a running mate on defense, and then maybe another additional weapon or two, and they could be right there because they have a young quarterback. Even though they're making the playoffs this year, the Commanders is another one because, again, a young quarterback is going to get you much further than, an established veteran would. If my choices are, do I pay Jaden Daniels $5 million or do I pay Joe Burrow $50 million? And if I pay Jaden Daniels $5 million, can I add on $45 million in talent around him? I'm going to take option A.
So, Sam, do you think there's an AFC team that could be
I
a
would float
draft away?
Yeah, the closest team I think that's not going to make the playoffs this year might be the Colts, which is an odd team to say because they just had the disaster against the Giants. But, I mean, they got 7 wins this year with Joe Flacco and Anthony Richardson playing quarterback. Richardson's had obviously splash moments, but the consistency down to down just is not there for them right now. The offense, they have a quality offensive line. I know they got some aging players. Think about some injuries to Ryan Kelly. But they have still a quality offensive line to work with here going forward, and they have some young players up front and Ryman and Gonzalez, who are good quality players who can fill in for you when you have those injuries. They have receiving options. We've seen Alec Pierce have good games this year. Josh Downs, we know, can be quality when he's healthy. Michael Pittman's been productive in the past, and A.D. Mitchell hasn't gotten really put together mentally this year, but he has a lot of physical talent. On defense, they have a nice mix of veteran players who are maybe getting a little bit late in their primes, but you also have a ton of young players as well. So you have the leadership pillars there defensively and the pieces filling in around them. So this to me is a team, especially in that division right now. If you had if you had a Baker Mayfield on this team, you probably win 11 games at least, I would say.
At one point I was gonna suggest the Colts, but instead I was just gonna pivot around to make sure everybody could kind of chime in. So
I'm a Patriots guy. I think it's the Patriots. I'm a big Drake May fan. Loved him. Had him higher than Caleb Williams for sure. They are the 2020 Bengals right now. Like they started their quarterback later instead of us, we had the injury. But they're going to get a really high draft pick that they can then go pair with their young quarterback. They have $131 million in cap space. The Bengals 2021 free agents class was Trey Hendrickson, Chidobe Awuzie, Mike Hilton, Samaje Perine, Larry Ogunjobi, all these big hits that we hit in free agency that year that weren't crazy money, but they were all hits. We had a few other that were duds, but still, the Patriots have an insane amount of money. They have a young, in my opinion, very good quarterback. If they can hit in the draft as well and have at least a few impact players in the draft, I think they could jump right up and compete. And they do have some tough competition in their division, but I honestly don't see the Dolphins on an upward trend. So it's the Bills that they have to really contend with, in my opinion. So
I definitely think the Patriots can make the playoffs. So, Rock, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. Do you think the Chargers, the Broncos can win the division while Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid are still paired up?
I do. And the reason why is because I think the Chiefs, they're not going to regress, but they're going to have to evolve. And if that process does not work flawlessly for them, there's going to be an opportunity for both teams to compete against the Chiefs. We saw it this year. Both of them were virtually a play away from knocking off Kansas City in every game that they played against the three teams. Of course, you got to wait to see what happens in the season finale with the Broncos, but of course, the Chiefs aren't going to be playing their starters, so we won't have a good look. To me, it comes down to who can, not necessarily a superstar can they add, but what defensive depth pieces can they add? So when they play Kansas City later on in the year and when injuries start piling up, who is going to be able to step in to be able to cover the guys that Mahomes can take advantage of as the year progresses. Mahomes is great at the beginning of the year because you haven't seen him yet, and he's pulling out all kind of wild things they've been designing up behind the scenes. Mahomes is great at the end of the year because he knows how to find the advantageous matchups. If you can have a good, strong, if you have a good depth in your defense, and so when your top guys do go down, there's not that much of a drop in talent, i.e. the case of Riley Moss, which he went down for an example. I think that you could see the Chargers and the Broncos overtake the Chiefs for a season or two. But at the same time, Kansas City is going to rule the division for the next 15 years, at the very least as well. So one or two of those might be a division crown for them, but the Chiefs will make the playoffs every year.
So I think outside of the AFC East, the drafts for the Broncos and the Chargers are probably the ones that I'm most interested in, because they're like, Harbaugh is an excellent coach. And like, I have the utmost respect for Sean Payton, and they have to and they chose teams in the same division as Mahomes, right? Because like Harbaugh had his choice of what team he was going to coach, and my opinion is Sean Payton did too. I'm definitely looking forward to Mahomes going up against a Sean Payton coach team or a Jim Harbaugh coach team for the next several years.
And the interesting part in all that might be how the Chiefs evolve as a franchise when some of these pillars of the organization start to leave. You talk about the aging players, team players who are hitting for agency. I think Trey Smith still doesn't have a contract extension. Joe Thune, I think, has one more year after this year, I believe, and then he becomes a free agent. He's also an aging player at guard, who's playing some tackle for them now. Chris Jones is going to be a bit of an aging player here in the next year or two. You're going to have to start looking at what's the future look like without him. Travis Kelce, obviously, is not the same player. They've got a lot of those guys are going to turn over, and they're going to have to find some new pillars for the team in the next 2 to 3 years. On top of that, they have some immediate issues potentially at depth. When talking about the interior defensive line, most of their interior guys outside Chris Jones are free agents after this year. They only have one quality edge rusher in Carl Lotz. I know Chris Jones bounces out there sometimes, but they don't really have a true star on the edge. And then on your receiver room, a lot of these guys you brought in to be stopgaps are all free agents as well. You're left basically with a shell of your interior defensive line, shell of your receiver room after this year. And on top of that, we don't know what's going to happen with Rashee Rice legally at the start of next year, with that whole case going on potentially. So you might be without Rashee Rice for almost the majority of 2 seasons, depending on how things play out. I just don't know where the Chiefs are going to fill in some of these more premier roles along the defensive line at receiver. And then you have to talk about changing over all these veteran players as well who have been key pieces for your multi-Super Bowl run. They're facing an uphill battle here. If the team can pull it off, it would be the Chiefs. But I do think they're going to be more vulnerable than maybe people anticipate here during the second half of Mahomes' career.
Yeah, and kind of just jumping off your point, Sam, in their last 2 Super Bowl runs, that was all propelled by the haul they got back for Tyreek Hill, the trade to Miami. There is no tradable asset for Kansas City right now that could bring back that type of value, especially in some of the more premier picks in the draft. And they were able to go get Trent McDuffie and George Karlaftis in the same draft because of it. So I think that could also play a role in what Kansas City does moving forward. The one good thing for them is that Justin Reed is young, he's healthy, and as long as they have a strong player at the safety position, I don't see them falling off anytime soon. Making the switch from Tyrann Mathieu to Reed at the moment they did was a stroke of brilliance, and that's why I don't share the same hope that Kansas City will fall off like other people do. just because they have really some really good key players in key positions who are in their 20s.
Yeah, and my hope is Buffalo beats them and then they fall off. Because if they fall off, right? Seriously, if they fall off before Buffalo beats them, like that's a media story that'll never go away. Right? Like you never beat Mahomes in the playoffs or whatever, right? Like nobody's allowed to beat Mahomes until Buffalo beat, right? There's a part of me that like I don't want the media story to be that like Buffalo's path to the Super Bowl. I'll flip this. Do you know how many Pro Bowl quarterbacks the 2000 Baltimore Ravens played during the entire season? That vaunted defense played 0 Pro Bowl quarterbacks all year. But it's considered one of the best defenses in NFL history, and they never played a Pro Bowl quarterback. right? So like I wouldn't want that to be the story where you didn't beat such and such in their prime or whatever. So
That goes back to you wanting to play Burrow, Lamar, and Mahomes all in one run.
Right.
come on. Yeah, like I mean that's the only way to shut the media up. Well, and the media is never going to shut up anyway. But
True. No. But I mean, if Allen does win MVP and then proceeds to beat, those three quarterbacks, I mean, that the way the media would switch up on Mahomes would be honestly must-watch television. As someone who has watched that man terrorize my team twice a year for the past however many years. One thing that I do want to add, though, to kind of this discussion that I think is going to change the dynamic of these Buffalo-Kansas City games going forward is that when you look at how Buffalo and Kansas City has worked out in the playoffs, Kansas City has not won these games. Buffalo has lost them. I think that the Kansas City front office has recognized that. I think you're going to start to see them perhaps take a different approach in the draft strategy to counteract some of the problems that Buffalo has presented them in these critical situations.
Yeah. So I've got a question for the roundtable, and I'm curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on it. Which team do you think needs to hit their draft the most this year to still have a job this time next year?
Miami.
You said Miami?
Yep. Yeah, I could see that.
I would say Indy, probably Miami or Indy, right? Like those two teams that are borderline playoff teams, kind of like you need to hit now. You're at the stage where you're running down like 2, 3, 4 years here. You gotta hit now, and you gotta showcase you win, or at least showcase you have. If you're Miami, the explosiveness you had in offense last year with better defensive talent, like better overall team building, and be able to win some cold weather games, like sprinkle 1 or 2 in there to be nice. And if you're the Colts, you need to have a competent passing attack. Like you need to have those things in place next year. And if you don't, they're both probably gone.
So Miami would have been my first vote, but then I started realizing that Greer may not make it through this season.
Yep.
But here's a good one. Here's a good one for you. It's Houston.
That was who I was going with.
Don't let last year fool you. Like one of the things that I'll say often is that the wild card round of the playoffs has flawed teams, right? And Houston got bounced last year, and like the game, I don't know that the game was competitive, right? Because I believe Buffalo bounced them in the first round of the playoffs last year. And then Houston comes back and they play Buffalo early this year, and that was like Houston's Super Bowl. Right? I mean, they threw their A game at Buffalo kind of thing. For Buffalo, it's just another game. But I don't know that Houston is as good as the playoffs led everybody to believe last year. And the reason why I say that is that look at the division they're in. We've already established that the Colts, with a good draft and even just a slight notch in quarterback play improvement, likely gives the Colts that division. Right, but it wouldn't shock me to see Tennessee go worst to first. It would not shock me at all if Tennessee is in the playoffs next year. Right, they have the offensive line in place that Brock was saying. You just need to put a quarterback behind it.
Another one. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say sometimes you have these teams that outperform expectations like year 1, year 2, and throws off the entirety of their bill. Look what the Giants did when they made the playoffs that one year and they beat the Vikings. And it changes everything for them mentally in terms of their timetable, and it makes everything almost impossible to work 3-4 years down the line. So I do think there's a possibility that could happen.
So do you think a single playoff win like that, Sam, is what convinced them to extend Daniel Jones?
I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. The Mara family and like their relationship with Daniel Jones and the Mannings, who kind of pointed to Daniel Jones a little bit through the draft process, probably played into that. But I do think that, and maybe some poor GMing as well, played into the whole situation regarding the extension. But I do think there was enough momentum in the building going forward, and with the fan base as well, where they wanted to have a franchise quarterback. They wanted to believe he was the guy. I think they were the only ones who did. I knew Giants fans at the time who were not very happy about the fact he got the extension. And I think everyone I talked to within my circle was like in a little bit of disbelief by the fact that the extension got done when it did, and for how much money it got done.
And for what they did with Daniel Jones, you're just better off. You franchise Daniel Jones and you extend Barkley, and they did it the exact opposite way.
Yeah, and that didn't make much sense to me, but I do think that playoff win, that season in particular, set them back multiple years. One, because they thought they were ready to compete right away, and two, because they bought into Daniel Jones because of it.
Yeah. So, Ryan, were you going to chime something in there a few minutes ago?
Yeah, I was going to say another team that I think could be partially because of fan hostility would be the Niners. They're a team like they're 6, maybe 7, depending on this week, but probably 6-win team this year. They've got Javon Hargrave, Travaris Ward, Dre Greenlaw, Devondre Campbell, Hufanga, all free agents. They do have some money, so I'm sure they can bring some of those guys back. But they've got to get back on the horse because from what I've seen on social media and some of the writers as well, the feeling around the coaching staff there right now is on edge. It's not as fun, Kyle Shanahan love as it was because, despite all the injuries, their team is not performing what they expect. So I think that could be one of those ones that, they just decide it's time to move on if they don't hit the draft this year and get back to competing.
So I saw a stat. This needs to be fact checked, but in the last, I'm going to say it's 28 years of the 49ers, they've made the Super Bowl 7 times and they've missed the playoffs 19 times. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm. So, I know for sure. I mean, we can see it in his results, but I was able to talk to a couple people about it. Rest in peace to him. But Terry Donahue was always panicked in the draft room, like all the time. So that definitely contributed to the kind of the early issues in the 90s and 2000s. But I kind of just want to jump, since we're talking about the draft, and please don't kick me off the show, Jim, for saying this. With Ryan and Sam's point, I thought I'd touch on the Niners. One, I don't even think, no matter what happened, in case everyone was healthy, the Niners would have been successful this year because, one, Kyle Shanahan has a well-documented ego problem, and it has existed for a long time. It's like Big Brother in there. He's got a camera in every coaching room and with a mic that he can speak into at any time. And when you have that, it always builds a tense environment. Secondly, look at Christian McCaffrey's wedding and how many of his teammates went. I think I don't want to do the old draft day thing about how many guys at the Bo Callahan's birthday party, but I do think that when you have a certain amount of teammates and a certain group of teammates attend your wedding and nobody else does, I think that speaks volumes when you look at across sports organizations in general. The ones that are successful are all unified on and off the field. And then the third part, even regardless of who they draft, they'll never be able to settle in, especially on the defensive side of the football, because Kyle Shanahan will always blame them when the Niners lose, as he did last year with Steve Wilkes, and as he has done with the past. And I think no matter what moves you make, I just don't think it's going to change unless Kyle Shanahan is running the show and is able to manufacture things like how he's done in the past. I also think if John Lynch leaves San Francisco today, he gets a job tomorrow, without a doubt. I think he's going to be a much better GM away from Shanahan now that he has had the experience he has had under his belt. For the Colts, first of all, I don't know how Chris Ballard has remained a GM for as long as he has. I'll be honest, I've been calling for his head like 3-4 years ago, but that's a credit to him. I think that they fall under the same issue that the Niners do, but instead of Shanahan, I think Jim Irsay is a massive problem. And I feel like whoever they bring into that organization is not going to work out, because at one time they had Hall of Famers all across the field on both the offensive and the defensive side of the ball. And the fact that they only got one Super Bowl, which I will say was a very lucky achievement in themselves during the Peyton Manning era, speaks volumes. They also haven't established a true top. I mean, you guys can disagree with me with this, and I understand, but they haven't established a true top wide receiver one since T.Y. Hilton. And when you go that long without having a dominant guy at the pass catching positions, it just does not lead to success regardless of who your quarterback is. And
in fairness, Ballard was one that replaced Bill Polian, right?
No, he replaced Gregson.
Yep.
So
okay. So that was a GM. Okay,
because probably even worse, honestly.
If you fire a Hall of, like, I have the utmost respect for Bill Polian. took 3 teams to the Super Bowl.
Oh,
Right, because he took the Bills, then he took the Panthers, and then he took the Colts.
Yeah.
Right. So there's definitely dysfunction above the general manager in Indianapolis.
Hey, Jim Irsay gives away some really cool things on Twitter. So
yeah. Jim
Does he?
Irsay also tried to fly a killer whale in a private plane to the ocean after like 50-something years in captivity, and he also plays off-key guitar for free for the Jim Irsay experience. So I really don't trust that man with football decisions moving forward, especially when you look at. I mean, for Bill knows this because obviously he's a Cleveland guy about having what it's like for a franchise to go through quarterbacks year after year after year. That's the Colts. They go through quarterbacks year after year after year ever since Andrew Luck retired. And when you can't find a single guy to stick with through multiple consecutive full seasons, that's more than just a player. That's an organizational failure. And that's why I don't think that, regardless of who these teams draft, is going to be successful. To our point earlier is you can draft all these great guys. You still got to coach them up. And there'll never be enough stability inside the facility for that to actually pay off by the time year 3, year 4 comes around, because year 3, year 4 will never come around.
Yeah, Brock, you're welcome in this channel with takes like that anytime. I absolutely love it. So,
and I'll piggyback on Brock. Living in Indianapolis, I've seen it all firsthand. He is hitting the nail on the head. There are a lot of people in and around the Indianapolis facility that I talk to frequently that say that same thing. I mean, look at the article from The Athletic earlier this week where it dove deep into Indianapolis's culture or lack thereof, and that there's veterans on that team that are disappointed with the way the team has gone. And you look at it, it starts from an owner perspective, and we give owners a lot of grief, but sometimes the best ones are the ones that either A, just give a blank check and say go, or B, that you never see. For every David Tepper that's hands-on, look how many successful seasons David Tepper has. I mean, firing a head coach after a year. Jim Irsay, that same example, how many times he churned through Grigson and churned through Ballard and churned through all these additional quarterbacks. Whereas if you look like the ownership for Kansas City, the ownership for Philadelphia, Detroit's ownership, for example, when Dan Campbell was 0-10 to start the season, 1-9 to start the season, they didn't say, okay, we're done. We're just going to immediately shut it down and go. They gave him ultimatums. They gave him opportunity to push through it and work through it, and now they're better for it. Imagine if that ownership had been haphazardous and said, you know what, we're tired of losing, we're going to fire you and hire the next bright offensive mind. Would Detroit be the Lions they are today?
Yeah. And a little bit to your point, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Green Bay Packers have had 2 of the best developmental guys. Like Aaron Rodgers comes in, sits behind Favre, then Jordan Love comes in, sits behind Rodgers. The only reason they can even do that is because they don't have like a de facto owner. If you had a real owner of that team, that would never happen. And Jim, back to your point on the 49ers, they have missed the playoffs 17 times in the past 26 years.
And they've made the Super Bowl 6 or 7 times in that same time span, right?
They have made the Super Bowl 3 times in that time span.
It's the stat you're looking for is the NFC Championship game. That's what they've made the 7 times.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I do think to both your points, like having the hands-off owner who's willing to let the GM, the people you hire, make the decisions, that's really like a key here. I think that's actually something that's a competitive advantage for a lot of teams that you see sometimes the teams that don't have that person tends to backfire quite often. And owners who are very hands-on, who have had success early in their ownership, like Jerry Jones did, they constantly chase that feeling. They constantly want to chase that, and they get more and more hands-on because they feel like they were want a part of it, and 2, they want to play an active role in reestablishing that, and it doesn't always work out. I'll be very curious to see if the Patriots can pull it off, because frankly, I'm curious with Kraft now, with Belichick being gone, Brady being gone, what role Kraft will be for that team going forward. Because if he gets, he wants to win, obviously. There's plenty of pictures mid-game and broadcasts of Kraft just looking so distraught up in the booth, and the Patriots getting smacked around this year in past seasons. I'll be curious to see if he becomes a little bit too hands-on for that team going forward and maybe sabotages their current build.
Yeah, I think you talked about leadership, organizational leadership a little bit, and it cracks me up because, like, being in the military for as long as I was, all the worst leaders I had were the ones that were too hands-on and didn't trust the people that that were put in position to lead. And sometimes the best organizations were when the leaders, were gone for a while. That's the Packers. They don't have a full leader, like it's just the staff running everything. So like that, it really is true that organizational leadership is such a big deal. And then like the Bengals are an example of when they don't have enough money to have a staff. So
so Ryan, I'm huge on leadership. So I've worked in corporate America for a while. I'm now a defense contractor. And I will definitely agree with you that the military is devoid of leaders. And granted, if my boss ever sees this podcast, I'm probably going to be fired. But it blows me away. And whether it's running a podcast, and leadership can take many shapes and forms. And I know a lot of guys at the Draft Professor give me a lot of credit for just bringing everybody together. That's in some ways, that's just leadership, right? But going back to like an NFL team, I look at like there's so many different ownership styles, but you could put Kraft and Jerry Jones in a very similar category. They think they know how to make the decisions for a team to win. But I look at plenty of other teams where like I'll put like the Pagulas in that category. You don't hear anything out of the Pagulas about the hockey team they own or the football team they own. Their job is to cash the checks. They're not making the organizational decisions, right? And I'm sure we can find other owners that are hands off like that. Like I think like Arthur Blank actually to a degree, I think recognizes that is that, he wants his team to be good, but he doesn't seem to be hands-on. And I would actually say the same thing. I think it's like Jeffrey Lurie in Philadelphia. Yep. He doesn't seem to be as hands-on as a Jerry Jones or a Robert Kraft. But, I mean, I don't follow those teams, so I don't know that for certain. That's just the vibe I get.
You're absolutely right, Jim. I have a theory. It's called the 73 theory, which is once hands-on owners become 73, they start thinking about the mortality, and thus they feel that they're in a win now mode. As much as it's kind of funny to think about, it's the reality of it. And I first thought about it when I was 12, and that was when Al Davis passed away, because I had a bunch of family that was Raiders fans, and I spent my entire youth hearing them complain about all the players that he was drafting. Russell, McFadden, Darius Hayward-Bay, I think Napoleon Kaufman or something was around that time as well. And I think we're seeing the same thing with the Dallas Cowboys, especially the Patriots fire a Gerard Mayo. I think that we could potentially see Kraft start to go down that route as well. Going back to our conversation earlier about Houston, I don't think Ryans or Cesario is in that position because McNair is still a bit younger and he understands that his franchise has not been good for some time now, so you can't like change things up before it can because it might get worse again. And then alongside that singular fact, Jack Easterby is no longer inside the building, which I think is definitely going to help provide more stability when it comes to that organization. But when you look at the rest of the AFC South, that's when I start to question the role ownership has. Obviously, we talked about the Colts already. The Titans, I'm not too sure where their heads are at, especially financially, because if I'm an owner, as much as I want to be hands-off, somebody tells me we're trading away A.J. Brown, I'm running down there right now to stop that trade. I think that there's too much hands-off ownership when it comes to Tennessee, and that's why I don't believe they'll be able to turn it around in one season. And then when you look at the final team, the Jacksonville Jaguars, I'm not exactly sure how big of a role Tony Khan has within the Jaguars organization, but if it's running anything like AEW, you're going to start to see some very interesting moves get made, even worse once a guy like Doug Peterson leaves and a guy like Trent Baalke, who an egotistical GM, maybe paves the way for someone that's more of a yes man moving forward.
So I want to give a shout out to the Napoleon Kaufman. I remember as a kid watching the NFL draft, and that was one of the first drafts I ever watched. And I remember when they made the Napoleon Kaufman pick, and they said he's not the best running back on the board, but that was a Raiders pick. So I don't know how old the rest of the audience is, but you can probably – Napoleon Kaufman was a very fast running back, but I'd have to go look. There were other running backs that were taken after him that were probably significantly better NFL players.
Yeah, I've learned that in the first round, if somebody says that's a very Raiders pick, they're a bust. So, it's unfortunately a time-tested method. I think I heard that about Damon Arnett, Henry Ruggs, and of course all the other names that I mentioned earlier. So
we've been going for 75 minutes, and we have a lot of people watching. It's getting late on a Friday. I want to thank everybody for being here. Let's kind of go around and let everybody know kind of who you are, how they can find your content. We'll start with Sam. There's definitely a lot more people now than there were at the beginning of the podcast. So feel free to let them know who you are. And
yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Sam_Teets33, which is on the screen right now. I write for Chiefs Wire currently and for USA Today's network. I do most of their scouting reports. I also run my own Substack account, which is free to access. It's basically like a daily newsletter. I publish 5 or 6 times a week. Usually scouting reports, a lot of stuff that's focused on college football, but also get into some all-pro teams here for the NFL as well as their regular season winds down. So you want any kind of varied football content, it's going to be there. And I'm already starting the process of scouting guys for 2026. So if you're looking forward to some of those reports, those should be coming out probably after the Senior Bowl here in January.
Cool. Ryan.
Yeah, I'm at Ryan Dio Sparks on X, and I don't have a ton of content right now. This is just really the beginning thing for me. I've mostly done it on my own, but you can find me on X, mostly talking about the draft, occasionally trolling Bill with telling him the Browns are going to draft Will Campbell.
Don't you put that curse on me, sir.
But yeah, hopefully I'll start coming out with some of my own stuff here soon.
Okay, Brock.
Brock Vera. Just wanted to say shout out to the Wired Networks that Sam works for. I got my start, my first paid gig with Rams Wire. I've recently transitioned over to Sports Illustrated, so you can check out my work on Rams on Sports Illustrated. Obviously, I cover the team. I also cover UCLA football. Bill just gave a great quote for an analysis for an article I did about Carson Schlesinger, the linebacker out of UCLA. So check that out. And follow me on Midnight Sports there at MNS Today, right there at my @ and I follow back. So love talk football with you guys.
Cool. Bill.
Yeah, so you can find me on X at Sparks Scouting, as well as at Draft Detectives as well. I do all sorts of NFL and NFL draft content. Currently have a 2025 big board of over 400 prospects and about 100 for the 2026 class as well. Also a writer and analyst for CadesDraftRoom.com. Also, I joined Jim here on the DraftProfessor.com network, as we like to call it, with daily draft content. So if you haven't already, make sure that you like the video. Make sure you share the video to all of your friends and your enemies as well. If you want to tease them with some draft content, make sure you hit the notification bell so you get subscribed to all of our daily draft content. Next week is our Pride and Joy. It's our quarterbacks week. Discovery Channel's got Shark Week. We've got Quarterbacks Week, where we talk all things signal callers. Jim, I will turn the keys over to you to let you wrap it up.
Yeah. So everybody, thank you. Like, I had an idea, I put something together. I definitely want to give a shout out. It's great to see Brock on a live podcast. So Brock was one of the first people I showed my draft simulator to 3 years ago. Right. And Brock and I have been doing mock drafts with each other offline for the better part of 3 years. So Brock, it's really good to see you again. And Sam, great to meet you. Ryan, great to meet you. You guys have been active in the chat and other podcasts. So that's something we try to do on this channel. If you're active in the chat and we recognize where your content comes from, we'll definitely prove that our followers are real, right? So, there are some draft accounts that don't have a face. Everybody here, you can put a face to their content. That's part of what we're trying to do here at the Draft Professor. So, as Bill said, daily draft content. There are some days, like today, that we have 2 podcasts, right? So, next week, Quarterbacks Week. And if you want scouting reports, we have about 225 scouting reports in the YouTube channel. So the goal was to do scouting reports for the top 175 players. We've done some small school specials. We have players following the channel. So if the players are watching our podcast, you should be too. I'm just saying. So on behalf of everybody at the Draft Professor, all 21 of us, for Ryan, Sam, Bill, Brock, myself, thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you on a podcast again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast, brought to you by the Draft Professor. Please follow the Draft Professor on YouTube, X, and Twitter at NFL Draft Fanatic. No, I am Fanatic. If you have a moment, try using some of the Draft Professor mock draft functionality, including a first-round challenge, a second-round challenge, rank players, and draft a team. Thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you on our daily draft podcast tomorrow.